There exists in the archives of human courage a night so improbable, so physically impossible, that even those who witnessed it struggled to believe what they had seen. On a blood-soaked plateau in the final months of the Second World War, a single unarmed man chose to remain behind when every other soldier retreated, and in the darkness that followed, he accomplished something that defies both logic and endurance. What happened on that escarpment was not merely heroism. It was something far stranger, far more costly, and far more profound. The island of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 was a landscape designed for slaughter. Volcanic rock erupted from the earth in jagged cliffs and ridges that transformed every advance into a vertical nightmare. The Japanese defenders had spent months preparing, carving tunnels and bunkers into the stone itself, creating a fortress that could only be taken at catastrophic cost. Among the hundreds of thousands of soldiers converging on this final stepping stone toward the Japanese mainland was a 26-year-old medic from Lynchburg, Virginia, who carried no weapon of any kind. His name was Desmond Thomas Doss, and he had already become a problem that the United States Army did not know how to solve. Doss had enlisted voluntarily in April of 1942, driven by a desire to serve his country, and by a faith so absolute it would nearly destroy him. He was a Seventh-day Adventist who interpreted the biblical commandment against killing with a literalism that permitted no exceptions, no compromises, and no weapons. The Army had seen conscientious objectors before, but they were typically assigned to non-combat roles, kept far from the front lines where their beliefs would not endanger others. Doss refused that path. He wanted to be a medic in a rifle company, to go wherever the infantrymen went, to face the same fire they faced. He simply would not carry a gun. What followed during his training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina was a campaign of escalating cruelty designed to break him. His fellow soldiers viewed him as a coward, a threat, a man whose refusal to fight would get them killed. They stole his Bible. They mocked him during prayers. They beat him when the sergeants were not watching, and some sergeants joined in when they were. His company commander attempted to have him discharged on psychiatric grounds, arguing that any man who would enter combat unarmed was mentally unfit for service. Court-martial proceedings were initiated. Doss was offered repeated opportunities to accept a non-combat assignment, to make the problem disappear for everyone involved. He refused every offer. He would serve as a medic with a rifle company, or he would face whatever punishment the Army chose to deliver. The case eventually reached a colonel who recognized that Doss had the legal right to refuse to bear arms while still serving in combat, and the discharge proceedings collapsed. The hatred did not. By the time his unit, Company B of the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, shipped out to the Pacific Theater, Desmond Doss was the most despised man in the company. He was assigned to carry the aid kit, the heavy bag of bandages and morphine and sulfa powder that could mean the difference between life and death, but few believed he would have the courage to use it when bullets started flying. They were wrong in ways they could not yet imagine. The first test came on Guam in the summer of 1944. The island was a nightmare of dense jungle and hidden Japanese positions, where men died from bullets they never saw coming. When the shooting started, something extraordinary happened. Doss ran toward the sound of gunfire. While other soldiers sought cover, he moved through enemy fire with a focus so absolute it seemed to render him invisible to danger. He found wounded men pinned down by Japanese machine guns and dragged them to safety one by one, ignoring the rounds snapping through the air around him. He treated sucking chest wounds under mortar fire. He carried men twice his size across ground swept by rifle fire. By the end of the Guam campaign, The soldiers who had beaten him and mocked him began to understand that they had misjudged something fundamental. This man was not a coward. He was something else entirely, something they did not have a word for. The pattern repeated on Leyte in the Philippines, where Doss became a figure of almost supernatural reliability. Soldiers learned that if they were hit, if they were bleeding out in some God-forsaken patch of jungle with Japanese soldiers closing in, Desmond Doss would come. He would find them. He would stop the bleeding and drag them back, and he would not stop coming no matter how much lead filled the air. His company began to see him not as a liability, but as a kind of guardian, a man whose presence meant that being wounded was not the same as being dead. Commanders noted his actions in reports. He received a Bronze Star for his conduct on Leyte. The hatred transformed into something more complicated, a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment, and the uneasy realization that this man operated according to rules no one else understood. Then came Okinawa, and the escarpment the American soldiers would name Hacksaw Ridge. The Mita escarpment rose 400 feet from the Okinawan countryside, a sheer wall of volcanic rock and coral that dominated the landscape for miles. Japanese engineers had transformed the plateau at its summit into a killing ground of interlocking fields of fire, hidden artillery positions, and interconnected tunnels that allowed defenders to appear and disappear like ghosts. Machine gun nests were carved into reverse slope positions where American artillery could not touch them. Mortar teams operated from caves with multiple exits. The entire plateau was designed around a single principle: any American soldier who reached the top would die there. Intelligence estimates suggested the position was held by a reinforced company, perhaps 200 men, but the true number was far higher. The Japanese had concentrated nearly a full battalion on and around the escarpment, and they had orders to hold it at any cost. The 77th Infantry Division received orders to take Hacksaw Ridge on April 29, 1945. Preliminary bombardment began at dawn, naval guns and artillery pounding the escarpment with a barrage that seemed sufficient to pulverize anything living on the plateau. The sound was apocalyptic, a sustained roar that made the ground tremble and filled the air with smoke and coral dust. When the barrage lifted and the first soldiers began climbing the cargo nets that engineers had hung down the cliff face, many believed the bombardment had done the job, that Japanese resistance would be minimal. They learned otherwise within seconds. The cargo nets swayed and twisted as men climbed, each soldier weighed down with rifle, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tools, and whatever else he could carry. Desmond Doss climbed with the others, his aid bag strapped to his back, his canteen sloshing with water, no weapon in his hands. The nets deposited the soldiers onto a narrow ledge near the top of the escarpment, and from there they had to scramble over the final few feet of broken rock to reach the plateau itself. The Japanese waited until the Americans were most vulnerable, caught between earth and sky with nowhere to hide, and then they opened fire. Machine guns erupted from positions the bombardment had not even scratched. Mortar rounds began to fall with mechanical precision, airburst shells that sent shrapnel sleeting across the exposed ground. Rifle fire came from caves and spider holes in bunkers so well concealed they were invisible until they started killing. The Americans who made it onto the plateau found themselves in a moonscape of shattered rock and splintered trees, with no cover and nowhere to advance. Men fell within seconds of reaching the top. Others were hit on the cargo nets and fell screaming to the rocks below. The attack stalled almost immediately, pinned down by fire so intense that movement meant death. Doss reached the plateau and immediately began moving toward the wounded. Soldiers were screaming for medics, their voices barely audible over the sustained thunder of gunfire. He could see men lying in the open, bleeding, unable to crawl to safety. He could see others dragging themselves toward the edge of the escarpment, trying to reach the nets and get down before they bled out. The Japanese had learned to target medics, recognizing that killing the men who stopped the bleeding was an efficient way to maximize American casualties. Red crosses painted on helmets and armbags were not symbols of protection. They were aiming points. He went anyway. He crawled through fire that seemed to come from every direction at once, following the sound of wounded men calling for help. He found a soldier with his leg shattered by a mortar fragment, bone protruding through torn flesh, and he wrapped the limb in a tourniquet and bandages while bullets struck the rocks around them. He dragged the man toward the escarpment edge, found another wounded soldier on the way, and dragged them both. He treated sucking chest wounds with the petroleum jelly-covered gauze that might seal the hole long enough for the man to survive. He pushed morphine syringes into men screaming from pain that had driven them beyond reason. He worked with a speed born from practice, his hands steady even as the ground around him erupted in geysers of pulverized stone. The problem was the cliff itself. Wounded men could not climb down the cargo nets unassisted. They were in shock, bleeding, sometimes unconscious. Dropping them over the edge meant killing them. Doss needed a way to lower them safely, and he needed to do it alone because every other medic and able-bodied soldier was either pinned down or already dead. He had brought rope. During a brief lull in the firing, he took a length of rope from his pack and began working through a problem he had been considering since the attack began. He needed a knot that would hold a man's weight, that would not slip or tighten under load, that he could tie quickly even with hands slick with blood. The double Bowline was the answer. 2 loops, one around the wounded man's chest and under his arms, the other around a makeshift anchor point at the edge of the escarpment. The knot distributed weight evenly and could be untied even after bearing heavy loads. It was mechanically perfect for what he needed to do. He tied the first man into the rope, checked the knot twice, and began lowering him over the edge. The rope burned through his palms as the weight came onto it, and he could feel the skin tearing, but he maintained tension and control, feeding the line out slowly until the man reached the bottom and other soldiers could pull him free. Then Doss hauled the rope back up, hand over hand, and went to find the next wounded soldier. The fighting intensified throughout the day. American forces managed to establish a small perimeter on the plateau, but they could not advance and they could not hold. Japanese counterattacks came in waves, small groups of soldiers emerging from tunnels to hurl grenades and fire at point-blank range before disappearing back underground. American casualties mounted with terrifying speed. Entire squads were wiped out. Rifle companies that had climbed the escarpment with full strength were reduced to shattered fragments. Officers were killed and replaced and killed again. The plateau became a charnel house where the living crouched among the dead and waited for orders that would either save them or condemn them. Doss moved through it all like a ghost. He seemed to operate in a state beyond fear, beyond exhaustion, beyond anything resembling normal human limits. Soldiers who saw him later reported that he appeared to know where wounded men were before anyone called for him, that he moved through fire that should have killed him a dozen times over without seeming to notice the danger. He lowered man after man over the escarpment edge, each evacuation taking 15 to 20 minutes of brutal physical labor. His hands were raw meat, the skin flayed away, bleeding with every pull on the rope. His uniform was soaked with other men's blood. He had not eaten since before dawn. He had not stopped moving since the attack began. By late afternoon, the situation on the plateau had become untenable. Japanese fire had not slackened. American ammunition was running low. Casualties had reached a point where the survivors could no longer hold the position against a determined counterattack. The order came down to withdraw. Every able-bodied soldier was to evacuate immediately, climbing back down the cargo nets under covering fire from artillery and the few remaining machine guns. The wounded who could walk were helped down. The wounded who could not walk were evacuated by teams of soldiers who risked their lives to carry them to the nets. Within an hour, the plateau was nearly empty of living Americans. Desmond Doss refused to leave. He could hear wounded men calling for help, their voices faint now, weakening as shock and blood loss took hold. He knew there were soldiers out there, trapped in positions where the evacuation teams had not been able to reach them, men who would die during the night without water or medical treatment. The order to withdraw was absolute. Remaining on the plateau meant being alone, surrounded by Japanese soldiers who would certainly patrol the area during the night, with no support and no possibility of rescue if he were discovered. He stayed anyway. As the last Americans descended the cargo nets and darkness began to fall, Doss was alone on Hacksaw Ridge with an unknown number of wounded soldiers and an entire Japanese battalion. The sun set with the abruptness common to the Pacific tropics, and the plateau was plunged into a darkness broken only by occasional flares fired by Japanese sentries. Each flare turned night into day for a few seconds, casting harsh shadows and illuminating the broken landscape in merciless detail, before dying and leaving the darkness even more complete than before. He began to search. He crawled through the night on his hands and knees, moving slowly to avoid making noise, stopping every few feet to listen for the sound of breathing or moaning or anything that might indicate a wounded man nearby. The ground was a nightmare obstacle course of shell craters and corpses and discarded equipment. He found a soldier wedged into a crater, unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid with shock. Doss checked the man's wounds in total darkness, his fingers reading the damage like braille, and decided he could survive the trip down. He dragged him to the escarpment edge, tied the double Bowline in darkness, and lowered him over. The rope burned deeper into his destroyed hands. He could feel blood running down his wrists. He hauled the rope back up. He found another man, then another. Each rescue required crawling through the darkness to locate the wounded soldier, assessing his condition by touch, dragging him across open ground to the escarpment edge, tying the knot and lowering the man down. The physical toll was catastrophic. His hands were no longer just raw but truly destroyed, the flesh hanging in strips, every contact with the rope producing agony that made him gasp. His shoulders burned with the strain of hauling the rope up after each evacuation. His knees were shredded from crawling over sharp volcanic rock. Exhaustion had progressed beyond anything he had ever experienced, a bone-deep fatigue that made every movement an act of will. The Japanese patrols were the worst part. He could hear them moving through the darkness, small groups of soldiers checking the plateau for American survivors, voices calling to each other in Japanese, footsteps crunching on broken stone. When a patrol came too close, Doss would freeze, pressing himself into whatever depression in the ground he could find, barely breathing, praying they would not see him. Flares would arc into the sky and he would close his eyes to preserve his night vision, feeling horribly exposed in the sudden light, certain that the next sound he heard would be a rifle shot or a shouted challenge. The flares would die. The darkness would return. He would continue searching. Time became meaningless, measured only in the number of men he found and the number of trips he made to the escarpment edge. Each evacuation took 15 to 20 minutes if everything went perfectly, longer if the wounded man was heavy, or if Doss had to stop and hide from a patrol. He lost count of how many times he made the journey. He lost track of how long he had been alone on the plateau. His world contracted to the immediate task: find a man, drag him to safety, lower him down, go find another. His prayers became a constant background rhythm, not words but a kind of ongoing conversation with God that had no beginning and no end. He begged for strength. He begged to find every wounded man before dawn. He begged to remain invisible to the Japanese soldiers hunting the plateau. His body began to fail in ways he could not ignore. His hands were so damaged that he could barely grip the rope, and he had to loop it around his forearms to take some of the weight when lowering men down. His legs shook with exhaustion, the muscles pushed beyond their limits, and several times he collapsed after hauling the rope back up, lying on the ground and trying to summon the strength to stand again. He was intensely thirsty, his canteens long since emptied by wounded men who needed water more than he did, and his mouth was so dry his tongue stuck to his teeth. Blood loss from his shredded hands was making him lightheaded. He knew he was approaching a point where his body would simply stop functioning, where no amount of willpower would be enough to stand or pull the rope or continue searching. He kept going anyway. The night wore on with a slowness that felt almost supernatural. He found men he had somehow missed on previous searches, soldiers hidden in shell craters or behind destroyed equipment, some conscious and able to whisper their thanks, others too far gone to know they were being saved. He found men who were already dead but checked them anyway, searching for any sign of life, any reason to drag them to the rope. Each living man he found felt like a gift, a reprieve, proof that he had not been wrong to stay behind. Dawn began to break around 5 in the morning, the sky lightening in gradations so subtle they were almost imperceptible. Doss was still working. He had found another wounded soldier, a young private barely out of his teens with a stomach wound that would kill him within hours without surgery, and he was dragging him toward the escarpment edge when he realized the darkness was fading. Full daylight would expose him completely, make him an easy target for any Japanese soldier who happened to look in his direction. He had perhaps 15 minutes before the sun rose above the horizon. He got the private to the rope and tied him in with hands that barely responded to his commands anymore. He lowered the man down, the rope cutting into his forearms because his hands could no longer maintain a grip, and when the weight came off the line, he stood there swaying, trying to decide if he could make one more search before the light grew too strong. The decision was made for him when his legs gave out and he collapsed. He lay on the ground watching the sky brighten, too exhausted to move, and waited for the Japanese to find him. Minutes passed. The sun cleared the horizon and light flooded the plateau, revealing the full extent of the carnage. Bodies lay everywhere, American and Japanese, some intact and some so destroyed they were barely recognizable as human. The ground was cratered and torn, vegetation stripped away, everything covered in a fine layer of coral dust that turned the entire scene into a monochrome nightmare. And in the middle of it, visible now to anyone who cared to look, was a single American medic who could not stand up. The Japanese did not fire. For reasons that no one has ever adequately explained, the enemy soldiers who must have been watching the plateau did not shoot. Perhaps they were low on ammunition. Perhaps they were exhausted from the previous days fighting and waiting for orders. Perhaps they saw a single unarmed man and decided he was not worth the bullets. Or perhaps something else stayed their hands, some factor that exists outside the usual calculus of war. The silence held. Doss eventually managed to stand. He staggered to the escarpment edge and looked down to see medics and litter bearers waiting at the bottom, men who had been receiving the wounded soldiers he had been lowering all night. They stared up at him with expressions that mixed disbelief with something approaching awe. He waved weakly, then turned and made one final search of the plateau, crawling through the debris field to check for any wounded man he might have missed. He found no one else alive. The job was done. He made his way to the cargo nets and climbed down, each movement of his destroyed hands producing waves of pain so intense they made his vision gray out. When he reached the bottom, other soldiers had to catch him because his legs would not hold his weight. They laid him on a stretcher, and someone pressed a canteen to his lips, and he drank water that tasted better than anything he had ever experienced. A medic began treating his hands, carefully cleaning the wounds and applying bandages while Doss watched with distant interest. The medic kept shaking his head and muttering that he had never seen anything like it. The count came in over the following hours as officers tallied the wounded men who had been evacuated from the plateau during the night. The number was approximately 75, though exact records were confused by the chaos of the battle, and some soldiers were counted multiple times. 75 men who should have died on Hacksaw Ridge, but did not because one man chose to stay behind. The officers conducting the count struggled to understand how a single person could have accomplished such a thing. The physical requirements alone seemed impossible. The courage required was beyond measurement. But Desmond Doss was not finished with Okinawa, and Okinawa was not finished with him. He returned to duty within days, his hands bandaged but functional, and he went back onto the escarpment when American forces made another assault. Over the following weeks, he continued to work as if the night on Hacksaw Ridge had been just another day on the job. He treated wounded soldiers under direct fire. He dragged men from positions so exposed that other medics refused to go there. He moved through the Okinawan campaign like a force of nature, relentless and unstoppable, and seemingly immune to fear. On May 21st, during fighting near Shuri Castle, a Japanese grenade landed near Doss while he was treating a wounded soldier. He saw it fall, had perhaps 1 second to react, and instead of diving away, he threw himself over the wounded man to shield him from the blast. The grenade detonated and shrapnel tore into Doss's legs and lower body, shredding flesh and cracking bone. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot agony that drove conscious thought from his mind. Other soldiers ran to help him, and he waved them away, insisting they take the wounded soldier first. They ignored him and began applying tourniquets to his legs while he argued weakly that he was fine, that other men needed help more than he did. They loaded him onto a stretcher and began carrying him toward an aid station. A Japanese sniper saw the group moving and opened fire. Soldiers dove for cover, dropping the stretcher, and Doss rolled off into a shell crater. He lay there while rifle rounds snapped overhead and realized with distant clarity that he was probably going to die here, that after everything he had survived, he was going to bleed out in a muddy hole while a sniper waited for him to move. Then he saw another wounded soldier lying a few feet away, a man with a chest wound who was drowning in his own blood. Doss crawled to him and began treating the wound, packing it with gauze while his own legs bled into the mud. When the sniper fire slackened, he insisted that the other soldier be evacuated first. They took the man away and came back for Doss, who had by that point lapsed into shock. During the evacuation to the field hospital, his stretcher bearers came under fire again and had to take cover. When they resumed moving, they realized that Desmond Doss was not on the stretcher. In the confusion of the firefight, he had rolled off or been thrown clear, and now he was missing somewhere in the combat zone. A search party found him an hour later, still alive, lying in the mud beside a destroyed tank. A sniper had shot him in the arm, shattering the bone, and he had crawled to the only cover available and passed out from blood loss. They got him to the hospital this time, and surgeons spent hours repairing the damage, removing shrapnel and bone fragments, and trying to save as much function as possible in his mangled limbs. He spent months recovering in military hospitals, enduring surgery after surgery, learning to walk again, fighting through infections that nearly killed him more than once. The war ended while he was still in a hospital bed. Japan surrendered and the world moved on, and Desmond Doss lay in a ward filled with broken men and wondered if he would ever be whole again. He survived, though he would deal with the physical consequences of his wounds for the rest of his life. On October 12, 1945, President Harry Truman presented Desmond Doss with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. The citation described his actions on Hacksaw Ridge and during the subsequent fighting, noting his extraordinary heroism and his refusal to seek safety when other men needed help. Truman placed the medal around Doss's neck and shook his hand carefully, mindful of the still healing wounds. Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor, a fact that seemed almost trivial compared to what he had actually done. The night on Hacksaw Ridge has been studied and analyzed and picked apart by military historians for decades, and none of them have been able to fully explain it. The physical requirements of what Doss accomplished seem to exceed human capability. Lowering 75 men over a 400-foot cliff using a rope and a hand-tied knot, alone, under enemy fire in darkness, without food or water, with hands that were being progressively destroyed by the work itself, should not have been possible. The psychological pressure of remaining alone on a plateau, surrounded by enemy soldiers who would certainly kill him if they found him, should have broken his mind. The statistical improbability of surviving that long in such an exposed position defies calculation. And yet it happened, witnessed by the men he saved, and the soldiers who saw him work, and the officers who counted the evacuated wounded and knew that the count was accurate. There are no easy explanations, no simple answers that make sense of what Desmond Doss did during that night and throughout the Okinawa campaign. He was a man who believed absolutely in the commandment against killing, and who believed equally in his duty to save lives, and he pushed both beliefs to their ultimate conclusions regardless of cost. He paid for his convictions with his body, his health, and years of suffering, and he never once suggested that the price was too high. He lived until 2006, dying at the age of 87, and in all those years he maintained that what he did on Hacksaw Ridge was not heroism, but simply what needed to be done, that any man in his position would have acted the same way. He was wrong about that last part. Most men would have retreated with the others. Most men would have decided that staying behind was suicide and that dead medics save no one. Desmond Doss was not most men. He was something rarer and stranger, a person whose faith and courage existed at such an extreme that they redefined what human beings are capable of accomplishing when the stakes are absolute and the cost is irrelevant. The 75 men who came down from Hacksaw Ridge that night, because he refused to leave them behind, lived, because one unarmed medic believed that saving lives mattered more than saving himself. That belief, and the actions it produced, stand as a testament to the furthest reaches of human endurance and the power of conviction maintained in the face of impossible odds. The rope that Desmond Doss used that night is preserved in a museum, a simple length of hemp fiber marked with old bloodstains. The double Bowline knot is now taught to combat medics as the Doss knot, a piece of practical wisdom born from desperate necessity. The escarpment itself remains, a geological feature on an island that has long since moved past the war that consumed it. But the story endures, passed down through generations of soldiers, a reminder that courage can take forms that look nothing like the stories we tell ourselves about heroes. Sometimes courage is loud and violent. Sometimes it is a quiet refusal to leave wounded men behind, maintained hour after hour through darkness and pain and exhaustion until the job is finished or the man attempting it is dead. Desmond Doss chose the latter path and survived to prove that such a choice was possible. The cost he paid was enormous. The lives he saved were real. The example he set remains, decades later, as strange and powerful and inexplicable as it was on the night when he worked alone on a plateau in Okinawa and refused to let other men die alone in the darkness. If this story has moved you, consider subscribing to this channel for more narratives from history that reveal the extraordinary depths of human character. Leave a like if you found value in learning about Desmond Doss and his night on Hacksaw Ridge, and share your thoughts in the comments. In a world that often demands we choose between our principles and our survival, what does it mean to be someone who refuses that choice, who insists that both can be maintained no matter the cost? When have you witnessed or experienced moral courage that came at a genuine price? These questions matter because stories like this one are not ancient history. They are reminders of possibilities that remain available to us if we are willing to pay the price that conviction demands.